Hi, everybody. I hope you're doing well. And I hope you also are enjoying Snowflake's Media Data Cloud Summit. I sure am, for sure. Just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Bob Hammond. I am the CTO of Choreograph. And I wanted to give you a little peek into some of the technologies that we're doing inside Choreograph off the back of Snowflake, which is pretty cool. And this is entitled, Where is My Data? So how we are actually building a data mesh using Snowflake to deliver superior client outcomes. But let me give you, just to start here, let me give you a little background on Choreograph itself so you kind of know our pedigree and where we're coming from. So about a year ago or so, WPP launched a global data company called Choreograph. That was an organization that WPP brought together from multiple divisions inside WPP to consolidate into Choreograph and bring together data assets and services on top of data for the support of our agencies and for our end customers. And if you take a look at the actual technologies that we deal with, right, Choreograph in many ways unlocks data inside of our brands to power deeper customer connections to fuel growth. Really what that is saying is that we are delivering end-to-end data enablement systems for WPP. And those go across three unique technical areas. One is called sync, compose, and perform. If you think about sync is basically delivering data ownership. It's providing private identity graphs that allow our brands to build out and own and control their own identity in their space. Then on the compose side, compose is really a multidimensional data enrichment and simulation platform. It takes the data, we can ingest that data into our systems. We can aggregate and build things like lookalike clustering, targetable data sets for demand side platforms, and then activate those campaigns into the demand side platforms. And then on the perform side, again, that's where we activate and optimize. So that's when we can take our data and our audiences that we've built within our platforms themselves. We can now target exactly the audience that we want based on the campaign that we're trying to deliver, and then export that data set to the individual DSPs themselves and activate those data sets against that particular campaign. So that gives you a little bit of a flavor of Choreograph, kind of where it sits within WPP, and also just a general sense of the technologies that we provide. So what I want to do on the agenda side today is to talk a little bit about data. And basically data is today's world's most valuable resource. So I'll talk a little bit about that to give you a little context there. And then talk a little bit about the data mesh strategy that we're starting to deploy here at WPP Choreograph, which is really, really quite interesting stuff. And then talk you through an example that's Group M UK is doing some stuff. And then what's next, which is kind of where we're going in the next phase of some of this stuff. So moving on a little bit, if you take a look about, oh gosh, even not that long ago or so, maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, the most valuable resource in the world was oil. So they pump the oil out of the ground and it fuels the economy, fuels cars, ships, airplanes, what have you. And of course it does today, but the world's most valuable resource in today's world is data. Right? And it's new rules of competition. So yeah, so if you actually take a look at the individual companies themselves, data really is the new oil, and that's in a literal sense. So if you take a look at Q4 of 2006 and take a look at the market caps of individual companies, the majority of the companies that sit on top of this are oil-based companies. So you see Exxon sitting right up on the top, right? And very prominent in this as well. And then as you get into Q2 of 2021, it really is almost completely dominated by data companies. So Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and all the rest. And I just find this interesting because these are the folks that have not only learned how to capture the data, and you got to remember, it's got to be in a compliant, safe, secure manner, and consented, of course, but being able to aggregate that data, use that data, discover that data, and then use that data in their companies themselves as they're pushing forward. And this is just another good representation of data itself. So if you take a look way back and starting in 2010, there's this concept of zettabytes, right? Which is a lot of data. Back in 2010, there was 2 zettabytes, 11.3, And then as you progress out, as we move out into 2021, we're up at 64. And then all the way as you move out into 2025, there'll be 160 zettabytes of data. That's a lot of data. So the problem is not that there's not enough data out there, because there's a ton of data. The real problem is how do you identify the right data? And then once you've identified the right data, how do you now organize that data, collect that data, store that data? Even more importantly, how do you identify the right sets of data? And then how do you actually use that data, right? And that's the basic problem that we're working on now inside of WPP and Choreograph. So now that you have a little background on the data side, and again, pretty fascinating how data has been pretty dominant over the last few years as far as market cap goes. If you look inside of your own organization, like we're doing, so we're a MarTech, ad tech, media consultative company. And as you can imagine, we have a ton of data like everybody else. Data is everywhere. There's event data, there's aggregate data, campaign data, e-com, DSPs, pipeline data, invoice billing, back office data, front office data, customer data, all sorts of different data types that are not only within Choreograph itself, but also amongst the individual Op-Cos that live inside of WPP. So if you sit back and try to understand not only what you have as far as data goes, but what the individual Op-Cos have in their arsenal as far as data goes, it's almost impossible to understand what's around you. And then these are actually stored in different ways as well. So there's data buckets, there's databases, there's file systems. That could be on-prem, it could be in the cloud, it could be in a managed service environment type of a situation as well. So we're in the midst now of aggregating all this data together in one common format. So that's the types of things that I want to talk about here going forward. So the first thing is that we want to organize our data. And what I mean by that is we want to organize, but not centralize. So if you take a look at this diagram itself, and you remember I talked about just a little while ago, I talked about the individual Op-Cos and their own data elements themselves. What we're actually doing is moving from Op-Co to Op-Co and helping those individual Op-Cos organize their data using Snowflake. So if you can deploy a common platform within all of the Op-Cos themselves with Snowflake at the center of that particular platform, now all the individual Op-Cos have their data themselves organized on a Snowflake platform, all partitioned, all defined use cases, right? And now not only can they discover that data themselves because it's all centralized within their particular Op-Co, but now I can actually mesh that data into a central representation of that data, right? So that allow me to bring it into the center with not necessarily physically bringing it into the center, but through a mesh, actually representative, bring it into the center, right? And then be able to take a look at that data and discover that data across all of my Op-Cos without actually having to collect it, and I'll bring it all back together again, right? So if you organize using snowflakes at the Op-Co level, you can bring it into individual data types, internal versus purchase, campaign data, group data, apply your controls, your access, your models, your execution controls, and then you mesh it all together. Then on top of that, you put a data catalog, and we're working with a company called data.world on the data catalog side. So that is a site that allows you to provision data in the metadata of that data itself and the descriptive natures of that, right? And allows you in a single website or UI to be able to search and discover, to understand by reading down through all of the documentation, understanding all the use cases against it, all the uses of the data itself, even things like who owns it, how is it priced, how is it distributed. And now you have the virtualization of data, but the discoverability of data using a partner such as data.world. And it's been pretty phenomenal on our side. And then this gives you just a little bit of a representation of how you democratize data across and what we've done within WPP as a whole, right? So the tools and services that we've deployed allows you to read about the data, get inspired from the data descriptions themselves. You can join discussion groups. You can sign up for different data and UI communities, which is pretty cool to actually interact and talk about data elements and what you're doing with data elements. It's a good way to ask questions, get answers to problems, look for other applications that are being written against those data sources and that sort of stuff as well. But you can also explore what data is available across WPP by using what we wrote, which is a thing called WPP Data Navigator, right? And then actually get down into the weeds of the data itself and explore those data sets and link to those using your data catalog, which, as I mentioned before, is from data.world, right? So this is essentially how we bring everything to bear, how we overlay all the context on top of it, and then we've built the supporting websites around it to allow you to discover, to interact, to socialize, to join discussion groups, to really understand and get immersed into kind of the data, the data ecosystem within WPP. So what I want to do now is switch gears a little bit. Hopefully I've given you a little bit of a view as to kind of how we're starting to think about organizing. How do we aggregate? How do we mesh using Snowflake? How do we catalog? How do we discover? How we interact? But this is a really interesting project called Umbrella. And the fellow that is running this is a fellow named Simon Lloyd. He's out of the UK in a Op-Cos called Group M. And basically, he's dealing with the same problems that we just talked about here, but in the Op-Cos specific area. So if you remember that diagram that I talked about before, the individual Op-Cos themselves have to build a platform or can leverage a platform to integrate their data, organize their data using Snowflake, partition it, produce the rules, et cetera. And this is exactly what Project Umbrella is all about. So they recognize that their data, just in their particular Op-Cos within Group M UK, it generally lies in other people's platforms, as I mentioned before. And really, for them to get the full potential of their data, they need to be able to land that data and combine it with other data assets, as I mentioned also. So Project Umbrella concentrates on 4 different layers, right? And this ultimately will become the cornerstone in the individual Op-Cos themselves to aggregate their data all together into a Snowflake before we mesh it into that central area, right? So they're in the midst of building an ingestion platform, pull that data into the platforms from any source, API, databases, feeds, buckets, et cetera, right? Store that. They push it through a pipeline. They can book that data. They can log and aggregate. They can run basically ETL processes on that data to format that data and store that in Snowflake. They can apply quality and governance across that also, which is very important as you pull that in. And then it provides the ability to pull in applications as they need to manipulate that data and orchestrate that data. Again, storing that data on Snowflake itself, right? And this now allows the individual Op-Cos to pull in the data, organize the data, store it on Snowflake, and then provide that orchestration of data into the mesh community for WPP as a whole. A little bit on the principles of the architecture itself. In many ways, this is the important one: is data is a shared asset, especially inside WPP. So data that is used or collected or aggregated or bought in other Op-Cos should be able to be used by others. Now, there's a very important concept to this, though. You have to be able to provide security, controls, consent, and access controls across all of this, because data that you acquire into your systems isn't naturally going to be used or have the ability to be used through consent across everybody. So you need to, for sure, provide that as security and access controls across that data set itself, right? They want to be able to design a usable set of data flows so that they can ingest the data, ETL that data into a normalized format, and then store that in a Snowflake environment. Scalability, again, that's one of the big pieces on Snowflake that allows us to auto scale these things as they grow, and we need more computes around that particular platform itself. This is going to remove duplications. This is going to remove multiple transfers of data, which is really, really good. You can buy the data once and hopefully use it in many, many applications if you centralize this stuff as well. And then, as I mentioned, this platform will provide some lightweight modeling characteristics as well, so that we can store this data in a usable form for many, many Op-Cos out there. So this is a kind of a busy slide a little bit, but it kind of carves things up for you a little bit. The main one that we want to take a look at here is the Snowflake pipeline here, right? So this talks a little bit about the data pipeline, the flows, but if you look at the top, right, there's the data source. It comes into Google Cloud, into GCP, into a particular bucket, right? There is notification queues. There's transformation facilities as well within GCP and to actually normalize and properly define and aggregate that data. That data now is pushed down into a raw data store, right? And then ultimately pushed down into Snowflake for the storage and distribution of that particular data set itself. And then there's a front end to this, so you can go in, if you want to, at the individual node areas, you can go in and now query that data, understand and discover that data as well through that particular UI. But also, as I said before, using data.world, you can now use the data catalog across all this as well. You got to remember, once the data is ingested, normalized, quality inspected, and then stored in Snowflake, we can now mesh that data into the central platform with catalog services for discovery on the outside of that. And then they mesh it, right? So this is actually an extension of what I just talked about, which is really interesting because you can mesh both ways. Not only can you mesh it to the center and be able to aggregate all of these individual data stores on Snowflake into a central mesh, you can also mesh outward as well. So this particular project is also meshing out, right? So as they actually pull in data into their systems and stuff as well, they're going to pull, like I mentioned, all of those data elements into the center, right? So they aggregate them all together, they normalize them, and then they stage them on a Snowflake environment. Now, from the center in Choreograph, we can now mesh with that to bring that into a unified view into the middle. But now you can also mesh out from that one part to secondary accounts as well. So now they can actually mesh out to Mediacom UK, Mindshare UK, Wavemaker UK, M6 UK. And this is very important for WPP as a whole because the customers that we deal with, right, are working with multiple groups inside of WPP. And as we start to build unified solutions for our customers, we also want to be able to unify our data sets, right? So we want to be able to pull it into the middle through meshing to discover, but we also want to be able to push out to individual Op-Cos through meshing technologies using Snowflake, such that we can now combine all of these data sets together so we can deliver a unified data and application and support and service for the customers inside of WPP. So that's kind of where we are. 2022 is going to be pretty exciting for us as we go down this journey. As I mentioned, some of our individual Op-Cos are kind of leading the way with us on this as well. Aggregation into the middle, unification, but kind of what's next as we go into 22. We're going to continue to register data within WPP's data catalog. Again, that's data.world. So we have about a year and a half's worth of data that we've been registering into that particular data catalog itself. We'll continue to organize our data using snowflakes within the individual Op-Cos, just like what I talked about with Group M UK in the project that they're working on. We're going to start to replicate those projects around other Op-Cos within WPP as well. Then we're going to build this central open data platform. So within Choreograph itself, we're in the midst of unifying our data sets in our data itself for all of the services that we run into a centralized open data platform, right? And then from that, one of the data sets will be inside of that data platform itself, a mesh that's going to unify all of the different Op-Cos data into a central area, right? And then we're going to provide that data access, data tracking, data governance, and data security around that mesh central area inside of Choreograph for the identification of data, the use of data. So thank you very much. Hopefully you found that really, really interesting. It's really interesting technology off the back of Snowflake that we're using, meshing technologies, data aggregation technologies. So again, I hope you enjoyed this and also have a great time as you talk more about various areas inside of the Media Data Cloud Summit. And thank you very much.